Good evening and welcome to our virtual Wayland Library event. Tonight we are so excited to have Stacen Goldman here with us. Stacen has worked in local history for 8 years and has been the curator at the Framingham History Center for the past 4. Her work is focused on democratizing historical collections and imagining creative ways of engaging with history through material culture. She strives to make people feel immersed, empowered, and emotionally invested in community history. Stacen holds a BA in history from Bard College and an MA in history with a certificate in historical agencies and administration from Northeastern. She was previously the director of the South End Historical Society in Boston. Thank you so much to Stacen for presenting tonight. I have just a couple Zoom housekeeping notes. First of all, we're recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access channel. So if you do show your face on video, you may see a little thumbnail someday on TV. Second, during the slide portion of the program, I recommend you switch your view to speaker view so you'll see Stacen's slides as well as her face. And feel free to add your questions into the chat box at any time. We're going to save it for a Q&A at the end, and I'm happy to read them aloud. Or if you would rather ask directly, you'll be welcome to do that too. And message me, Courtney, if you're having any technical trouble. So now that I've got that out of the way, I will hand it over to Stacen.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for having me to speak about this document. It's really it's something I have spent a lot of time thinking about lately. I think it's really important, and I'm glad that people want to learn more about it. I am Stacen Goldman. I am the curator at the Framingham History Center, just over the Framingham border. I am also a blogger. I blog at my personal site, which is the Thoughtful Museum. And the presentation that I'm going to give you tonight is kind of a combination of a presentation I've done for the History Center and that I've done, and a blog post that I've written for my blog. Right now, I can't see or hear any of you, but I'm wondering if any of you have been to the History Center, and if you haven't been to the History Center, would like to recommend very highly that you go sometime. I'm gonna start, and please forgive, I had some trouble with my slides, and now I cannot make them full screen for you. So you just have to deal with my toolbar at the top as we go. All right. So the latest exhibition that I've mounted at the Framingham History Center is called Framingham's Top 10. And it's an exploration of 10 of the most important items in our 14,000 plus piece collection. And that is correct, 14,000, not 1,400. Choosing 10 items to represent our collection out of this many really was not an easy task for us. And we decided that what we would do is actually we would leave some of it up to our community. So I created a list a short list of 19 items that was developed mostly between myself, key volunteers who work in our collections, and the staff. And we put that list of items up to a vote for the people of Framingham. And the top 3 items to get a vote were given automatic entry into the exhibition as Framingham's picks. So the things that got, the 3 items that got the most votes got automatic entry. And this bill of sale for Phoebe, who was a 2-year-old child, was one of those items. It's incredibly significant that our community wanted to know more about this object. What it signaled to me was that our visitors are ready to learn more about the challenging parts of Framingham's past and not just the triumphs. There's a lot that Framingham specifically is very proud of. There were 2 women who were arrested in the fight for suffrage. The innovative Denison Manufacturing Company, which just totally changed the face of stationery goods on an international scale, was headquartered in Framingham. And the Framingham Heart Study is something that people around the world know and that they're very familiar with, and that they are really proud of in Framingham because they've been contributing to this really important medical study for a long time. So when you have all of these things that you're constantly being made to feel that you can celebrate, it's very, very hard to force yourself to look at the ways that your community has actively caused harm to others. So as a curator, I'm really grateful that this document was one of Framingham's picks, because it's really impossible for me to tell a truly honest history of Framingham by only talking about those good things that we've accomplished. Yes, I definitely would have featured this object in the exhibition anyway, even if it hadn't gotten enough votes to make it in by the Framingham vote criteria. But the openness of the community to this story really did make my job just so much easier, because challenging objects are also some of the most powerful objects that we have in our collection. And they're one of the ways that we really can connect ourselves to the humanity of the past. I see my job as telling human stories and connecting communities to these human stories and making them really more real. I want the past to be more concrete and less abstract. This is especially important when we're grappling with subjects like enslavement. And this is because starting with the first generation of enslaved people 400 years ago, Americans have been actively programmed to think of enslaved people abstractly. That's the nature of dehumanization and the basis upon which enslavement and its systemic descendants are really built. So I wanted to start by examining and discussing the document itself. This is actually one of 4 bills of sale for enslaved people that the Framingham History Center has in its collection. And each document actually tells its own unique kind of story. Documents like this one are truly important in the study of enslaved people simply because there is often very little else about them in the written record, which we'll discuss just a little more in a bit. To have 4 documents of this type in our collection is remarkable, not just because it's rare for a small locally focused museum, but also because it illuminates how utterly common enslavement was in New England. And I found in my work that many people don't even know that there were slaves in the North at all. And the existence of so many documents attesting to its role in colonization and development of New England, all held in one place, can be a real eye-opener for people who don't even know that there were enslaved people here. So I'm going to read the bill of sale for you now. I have the text here, and maybe some of you have already been attempting to read it yourselves. So you can read along with me. This was written at a time that standardized spelling didn't exist. So it's a little tricky to go through without hearing it said out loud. Know all but men by these presents that I, Josiah Richardson Jr., of Sudbury in the county of Middlesex, gentleman, for and in consideration of the sum of £1 6 shillings and 8 pence lawful money to me in hand, well and truly paid at the unsealing hereof by Elizabeth Balch of Framingham in the county aforesaid, widow. The receipt whereof I do hereby acknowledge. And for the consideration thereof, do sell to the said Elizabeth Balch and to her heirs and assigns forever a Negro female child named Phebey, of about 2 years old, with her wearing apparel she now hath. And I, the said Josiah, covenants to and with the said Elizabeth Balch and her heirs and assigns, that the said Negro child is my slave for life, and that I have good right to sell and convey her in manner above said for the time of her natural life, and that by force and virtue hereof, the said Elizabeth Balch shall hold her, the said Phebey, for a slave for the time of her natural life. In witness whereof, I, the said Josiah Richardson, have hereunto set my hand and sealed this 13th day of August, Anno Domini, 1764, and in the 4th year of his Majesty's reign. Signed, sealed, and delivered in presence of us, Josiah Richardson Jr., Samuel Jones. So that's a mouthful. What did this document just say? Well, in way more words than it really needed to, it told us that at 2 years old, Phebeys enslaver, Josiah Richardson Jr., sold her and her clothing to Elizabeth Balch of Framingham for £1, 6 shillings and 8 pence. That's the modern equivalent of roughly $370. Now, you may think that for such an important source on the history of enslaved people in Massachusetts, there's actually very little specific information offered about Phebey here. In fact, all it says is that she was 2 and that she was Black. Honestly, it feels almost as if there's as much information conveyed about Josiah Richardson and Elizabeth Balch. Josiah Richardson refers to himself as a gentleman, and Elizabeth Balch is referenced as a widow. There's almost as much information about them as there is about Phebey herself. This is because when you are in the position of power and you're creating a document, you have the ability to erase the record that doesn't benefit you. And acknowledging Phebey's basic humanity didn't benefit Josiah Richardson. He didn't include information about Phebey's mother in this bill of sale. I still don't know who her mother was. I hope that someday I'll be able to locate that information, but it can be really tricky to track something like that down. He didn't say what Phebey was like. He didn't say if she was a picky eater, or if she liked to sing, or if she was intelligent or creative, or any of the things that an adult might observe about a child. How little it actually tells us says so much. And this was what struck me the most as I was incorporating the bill of sale into our exhibition. That a document like this, it's a document like this with very little actual information about the child involved that is meant to speak for her and tell her story. And what about all the other enslaved people who called Framingham home? Where could I find them? And would the records tell me about them as people? Or would they only tell me about them as possessions? And if you've taken some time to explore the digital version of the exhibit, or if in an extremely unlikely scenario, you got to see the exhibit in person, you may have noticed that each object was accompanied by an explore page, which was originally a kiosk, a touchscreen kiosk in the physical exhibition. And each of these kiosks had additional information relating to the subject, whatever the object was on display. And those kiosks were born very specifically out of my thinking about this object and how its erasure of Phebey's essential humanity tells a story that's so much larger than just the story of a single child. So in addition to trying to illuminate Phebey's story, I also made it my mission to try and give name to every enslaved person who worked in Framingham and who lived in Framingham. This isn't easy because the nature of enslavement means that very few records exist of these people's lives in the first place. So often all that we have to go on are legal documents like this one, and legal documents that are actively invested in dehumanizing these people. So these are bills of sale or estate records. If we're lucky, we might have a baptismal record, depending on if the church, is still working and they've decided it's worth maintaining these kinds of records down the line, which in Framingham, we are very lucky that one of our parishes has made an effort to maintain those records. But tracing enslaved families can be an even more challenging process because they often didn't stay rooted in a single community. They didn't have that option. For example, from the will of Framingham's first minister, the Reverend John Swift, we know that he enslaved 5 people in his household at the time of his death. And we see that in his will, he distributed the members of a family, the Benson family, all over the region to various Swift relatives. As families rooted in one place are sent to disparate locations, it takes a lot of work and coordination to reconstruct the continued records of those people's lives. And what strikes me about the forceful separation and movement of these families in wills like the Reverend Swift's will is that many of these enslavers wouldn't have imagined when they died separating a china set in their wills, but they separate families without a thought. So far in my quest, I have found 34 names of enslaved people who lived in Framingham, including Phebey. And my research indicates that in the 18th century, most prominent households in Framingham enslaved at least one person. So I'm positive that there were enslaved people that I probably haven't even located yet. I also, in my research, have had to acknowledge that one or two of the people on my list who I've listed as separately in our kiosk may actually be the same person, represented differently in separate records. So there are two Catos in the kiosk content who I think might be the same person, but I haven't been able to actually actively connect them. And this is because the names of enslaved people were sometimes poorly recorded, or they were forcibly or willingly changed. But this is just exemplary of the kinds of challenges historians face while they're trying to reconstruct the lives of enslaved people. Because it is incredibly challenging to reconstruct historical moments or figures when people have been purposefully erased. Historians have all kinds of tricks that they can use, and we know all the best places to search when we're trying to do this kind of work. But one of the most remarkable tools that we can employ when we're denied concrete information on a subject, especially on the subject of marginalized people, is actually easily available to any person who has the inclination to use it. And that's empathy. When we use empathy as a historical tool, we are harnessing our own humanity to mentally recreate a subject's experiences. If you thought that being a historian was mostly sitting in basements and deciphering curly Q handwriting in dusty books, this might not sound very academic. It might not really sound on point to you. But there are actually lots of alternative ways that historians learn about subjects that have been actively kept out of those dusty old books. There are cultural practices and family stories, historical food ways. We trace and study all of these and consider them absolutely legitimate sources when we're trying to reconstruct the lives of people who have been marginalized and who have been written out of the more traditional historical record. And so I believe that similarly, if we harness empathetic understanding, that is an absolutely legitimate way of engaging with the past when reconstructing lives that have largely been erased from the official narrative. And I mentioned before also just that I'm interested personally in making the past less abstract to those in the present. I find that to that purpose, empathy is the most effective tool in my tool belt. Almost by design, we easily forget that people who are as real and complex as we are, lie at the center of historical study. And some of this is due to the ways that we were taught history growing up. So many people come out of public school history education believing that the study of history is the study of names and dates. When one war started, when one war ended, the arbitrary names given to different historical periods, and all of the weird nicknames that you had for various historical parties during that time. Political parties during that time. The mugwumps comes to mind. These are the things that people think are the bread and butter of history. I had a history teacher who was one of the best history teachers I had in grade school, who had us memorize the names of all the presidents in order. He didn't have us learn anything important or meaningful alongside that exercise. He just made us memorize it. And I'm not saying that it isn't useful to have information like that, to remember names and dates, but there's no human depth involved. And it turns people into data points. And it ignores whole swaths of the human race. It ignores people that didn't leave their stamp on a whole country. It ignores people who did leave their stamp on a whole country, but were determined not to be suitable historical subjects. And this is especially true of people of color and members of other marginalized groups. Those people like Pheebey, may have been erased, but they aren't entirely gone. Their experiences, their emotions reverberate into this moment. You can ask any person who has had to contend with intergenerational trauma, and this could be due to all kinds of reasons, not just, because of racism, but any kind of intergenerational trauma that's made its way down through your family or through your culture. And those people will tell you that the past has meaningful emotional impact on the present, and sometimes meaningful physical impact on the present. So now I'm going to tell you what else I know about Phebey, both from the written record and from my own empathetic understanding. By the time she was 5, Phebey had once more been forcibly moved. I don't know if this was by sale or inheritance. I do hope to find that out at some point. And she was moved to the nearby Edgell household, where she was enslaved by Simon Edgell and his wife Mehitabel. We know this because baptismal records show us that the Edgells had her baptized in 1767. She was still in the Edgell household at the age of 13 when Mehitabel Edgell barricaded herself in her home with her children and Phebey on April 19, 1775, in fear of a slave uprising that never materialized in the wake of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Simon Edgell was a captain of Framinghams Minute Company, and so he was one of the first people to march off to Concord on that date, and I guess Mehitabel got a little beside herself about it. But this is actually all that we currently know about Phebey, these 3 data points. In none of them is she really given the agency to be fully human. She is an object in the lives of other people who are given the freedom to have full identities and emotions. So many questions about her remain. Was she in Massachusetts in 1783 to see slavery officially outlawed here? Did she even live to adulthood? 3 data points is actually a remarkable amount to know about a person who was actively dehumanized in the record, but there's still so many questions left to ask, questions that we may never be able to answer. But when we use empathy, when I use empathy, there are pieces of Phebey's story that I think almost any person could reasonably fill in. And these are really key emotional pieces, which I think are real parts of her life. So I personally think about Phebey a lot, and I'll show you why. These are my children. 2 of the key data points that we have for Phebey are at the ages of 2, when she was sold by Josiah Richardson to the widow Balch, and the age of 5, when we know she was baptized in the Edgell household. And those are the ages that my children are right now. My son turned 2 this August, and when I look at his face, I still see his chubby baby cheeks, and I can still see how he was just a baby, just a few months ago. His current favorite activities are singing at the top of his lungs while playing the triangle very offbeat, pointing out the letters that he knows on every cereal box he encounters, and coloring on a lot of things that I wish he wouldn't. He's an amazing, bright, independent, exuberant child. My daughter turns 5 in December. She is a natural performer. She enjoys doing craft activities. She enjoys drawing pictures and forcing me to guess what she's drawn a picture of, which feels like a trap. She loves princesses, mermaids, and SpongeBob SquarePants with equal ferocity. Watching her grow has been one of the greatest pleasures of my life. And when I tap into my empathetic understanding of Phebey's story, I feel so deeply the pain that Phebey's mother must have felt when her daughter was taken from her. When she looked at Phebey, I imagine that she might have still seen the chubby baby cheeks, the baby that she just was, the way that I currently do with my son. To have my son taken from me in that way, to be told that my children were not in fact my own, and to be reminded that my own life is not my own, that's a pain that I have never had to suffer, which I can so vividly imagine. My love for my children is how I know, even though this bill of sale doesn't say a single thing about it, that Phebey's mother longed for her when she was gone. Yes, there is a lot of information that I don't have about Phebey, but she and her unknown mother are so real to me because I can hold in my mind the life that she would have led and how far that life was from the life I would have wanted for her if she were my own child. When I watch my own children dance around the living room, I know in the back of my mind that 250 years ago, Phebey was not allowed to be a child in the same unreserved, exuberant way. Facing an object like this bill of sale is hard. and stopping in the middle of my day with my own children and remembering this little girl who had her family and her humanity taken from her is hard. But I also have to do it. Without the knowledge that I have about enslavement, marginalization, and dehumanization of Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color in the past, I would never understand the world we're facing in the present. I would probably be very scared and very confused by why the world was this way. And with one less person who truly understands where this country started, the world itself would be scarier and more confusing and even more unjust than it is today. Educating people on these topics and reinforcing the humanity of those who were and are subjected to systemic racism is the first step in creating a freer, more equal, and more just society. Humans are very complicated. The things that they do are not always good. Sometimes the things that they do are disgusting and ugly. Sometimes the things that happen to them are traumatic and painful. Sometimes using historical empathy means harnessing and understanding our own worst impulses or our own deeply held pain. And it's real work. But those of us who have never had our children taken from us also know how lucky we are that we only have to imagine it. Using empathy to imagine historical circumstances does not necessarily get us to the facts of a situation. Sometimes the facts may never fully reveal themselves. And to a certain extent, we need to be comfortable with that. But we also can refuse to accept that the story ends with the historical record. We can use historical empathy, and we can use that empathy to at least uncover true emotional truth. So I want to finish this program with something that's a little new, and I've only done one time, and it's an active empathy exercise. And this exercise can be really emotional. I'm not going to ask you to share anything about your experience of this exercise, so don't worry about that. I'm not going to make you answer questions, say anything out loud during the process. I'm only going to ask you to hold some thoughts and some ideas internally. If you all have your cameras off, so I was going to offer to let you turn your cameras off if you felt more comfortable. If you don't feel comfortable participating in this at all, because it is an emotional process, that's also fine. And you can mute the program now, and I'll give a little wave like this, just to signal when we're done with the exercise that you can come back in. I'll just give you just a moment to do that in case you want to. This is probably, I think we're probably good. All right, so everybody who's still with me, I'd like you to close your eyes, and I'd like you to breathe deeply. I'm going to ask you to picture a few things in quick succession. As each thought evokes a feeling in you, I want you to try and hold on to that feeling as we proceed to the next item. You ready? First, I want you to think of the loved one's face. How does that make you feel? Internally, name that feeling to yourself. Notice the physical sensation of that feeling and where it lives in your body, and breathe into it. I'd like you to hold on to that sensation as you think of a time that you have had something precious taken from you. How does that make you feel? How does that make you feel in combination with your loved one's face? Where does that feeling live in you? Where does that combination live in you? Breathe into it deeply. Keep that with you. Now I want you to think of a time that you felt powerless. Breathe into it. Try and hold all three thoughts in your mind at the same time. What is the sensation like? Is it uncomfortable? Is it exhausting? Is it something you already know well? Is it something you've never felt before? Now imagine, or maybe you don't have to, that you live in a world that is actively invested in making you feel this way, in tying your love to loss and powerlessness. Take a deep breath in and out, and in and out. You are, right now, in a very small way, recreating a piece of the historical reality that Phebey and her mother experienced. They are long gone, but with our shared humanity, we are connecting to them. It is too late to give them justice, but we acknowledge their pain by making ourselves vulnerable for them. And we project that pain outwards to recognize that this is an incredible power that we have as humans. The power of empathy opens our eyes to experiences that we previously thought unknowable. We project it forwards in time with a determination to use that empathy when we encounter others in the present. For them, we can make ourselves vulnerable and we can seek justice. Breathe. When you're ready, you can open your eyes. The exercise is over. I'm waving for anyone who muted themselves or muted me. I want to thank you all very much for coming. I'm happy to take any questions that you have. If you're interested, you can find more of my personal work at thoughtfulmuseum.wordpress.com, and you can find my work for the Framingham History Center at framinghamhistory.org, including links to the virtual version of the Top 10 exhibit if you haven't seen it. If anyone hasn't seen it and is interested in looking, I do have it up. I can screen share it during our Q&A, just so you can get a better idea. And there's one last thing, and that's that my boss would kill me if I didn't put a small plug in here for the Framingham History Center's virtual house tour, which is this weekend. And I think it's going to be pretty fun. It's a series of 4 videos of sort of inside tours of houses that are architecturally or historically interesting in Framingham. And they were all shot by Media Boss, who used to do work for this old house. So they're really good professional stuff. And that is this weekend, available for 48 hours. And you can find tickets for that at framinghamhistory.org. That's it. Thank you all so much for joining me during this process.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Stacen?
Yes, I can.
I'm echoing somehow.
Oh.
Thank you so much. That was really powerful. And I just want to say that having that kind of empathy takes courage. It's so much easier to just turn away, and sort of rattle off numbers about people who, I'm using the wrong language. I was going to say about slaves, but someone commented that you're using the word enslaved.
Yes.
So even that, little change and trying to imagine their lives, it's kind of radical.
Yeah. There's a lot that I find, and there's a lot that we do in public history specifically, where we try to recreate the past physically in the present. You can go to Plymouth and you'll see people living in that kind of house and wearing that kind of clothing and using specific tools and even like taking on the character of a specific person. But I don't think that there has been a lot of movement in specifically trying to recreate the emotional experience of history. And I think that's another thing that is actually even easier to do, because you don't need specialty products to do it. You just need your own mind and sort of a willingness to go there emotionally with yourself. And so I think it's incredibly powerful, and I think that it's a great way for people to connect to the past. I think it's so important.
So you said you did that exercise once before. I was going to ask if you've done it with school children or high school kids or anything. So
I haven't, not yet. No, I did it with my colleagues because I didn't want to. It was actually an idea that I've honestly just started to develop, and so I didn't want to unleash it on you or without having done it at least once to be sure that it was something that would be a good exercise to do. So yeah, I only did it with my colleagues. They were my guinea pigs. But I think it would be a great program to do with high school children. I think that's something that they might really understand and connect to.
Sure.
Courtney?
Yes, go ahead. Jane.
Yes. I just wanted to thank Stacen for her program and to tell you that about 20 years ago, I studied enslaved people in Wayland and in Concord, and that I have a lot of information. I don't know if you'd be interested on the Benson family.
Yes, the Benson family.
And on the Richardson family. So if I
the Richardson family would be very interesting.
I have loads and loads on the Richardson. In fact, I'm going to give a talk in Wayland in March on the enslaved people who lived here. So some way I'd like to connect with you.
Yes, I'm going to drop my email in the chat right now. Okay. If you can access that. So that's my work email, and I'm actually very interested in learning about the Richardson family, because sometimes that's the only way that you have to learn about enslaved people is specifically through the enslaver. And so I specifically, because they were not in Framingham, I don't have a lot of resources at my fingertips the same way I do.
The Benson family spent a lot of time in Wayland, and ultimately Frank Benson, if you know him, he was one of the Bensons, that he wound up being one of Reverend William Emerson's enslaved people at the start of the Revolution.
Yeah, the Benson family is pretty famous in Framingham.
They're famous everywhere.
Yeah, they're pretty famous in Framingham, and they are. And actually, in the kiosk for the bill of sale, I did specifically comment that there are a lot of enslaved people who called Framingham home at one time who are actually quite famous. So they're the Bensons. There's Peter Salem, who was famous for shooting Major Pitcairn at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And there's Crispus Attucks. And so, and I think the History Center and people in general tend to fall in the category of just telling the stories of the famous people who were from or in a place, and that is also true for the enslaved people. But like I said, I've identified at least 34 people, and only 3 of them are those famous people, you know? Right. There are so many other just humans that lie behind this that get buried, even when we think that we're being representative of enslaved people in their community. So we have to work harder and try harder.
I have a question when you're ready.
Yeah.
Just about the provenance of this bill of sale. Like, what collection did it come in, or how did you come to?
Yeah. So the bill of sale came to us through a collection that was developed by a man named Josiah Temple, who wrote sort of. It's one of like the classic. He was from Framingham, and he was a local historian, and it's sort of a classic like late Victorian local town history that he wrote of Framingham. And he had a huge historical collection of his own that was basically all of these really like some 16th century and not 16th century, sorry, 17th century and 18th century documents from the town's founding. So this is something that was part of his collection, I believe, along with another document that got into this exhibit, which was specifically a land deed for the sale of land from 5 Nipmuc men to an Englishman named John Stone. So he developed his own personal collection, which became, the historical societies and then the history center over time. I'm pretty sure that's where that one is from. I could double check on that.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. We're actually just so, honestly, I am constantly astounded by the kind of collection that we have at the History Center and the type of objects that we have and that we hold that honestly other places just don't always have access to, and especially local historical societies don't always have access to. And I feel very grateful that I get to work in it every day because it's incredible. Yeah.
Did you have a question? Go for it.
Hi, my name is Kelly, and I just had a question about, I'm a high school English teacher, and how do you connect students more closely to the accurate history that they had locally? You know, I've heard of different history teachers creating assignments where they have to research their local towns, but I don't really hear of that happening right now, you know, or like recently. I don't know if that went out of style. But yeah, just how do you kind of connect students and young, you know, kids to like our local histories?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of ways that you can do it, and I think, unfortunately, I think you're right about teachers. I mean, there are often local history parts of the lessons within elementary school programs and things like that. But I think there has been a move in the direction of standardized testing that actually it's not good for historical learning, because it really forces you into this sort of like names and dates version of historical learning that is it's not truly meaningful. And so that can be really challenging, and especially if there are budget cuts for things like field trips, which we have an annual third grade field trip. All the third graders in Framingham come to the History Center every year. Well, they didn't last year or this year. They didn't come this May, and they might not come next May, sadly. But we're trying to create other ways to reach out to them. And so I think it's the kind of thing where either you have to have a teacher who is willing to make that effort to work that into their curriculum, or you need a local historical society that's actively creating child-focused programming, which we do at the History Center. We're working really hard on maintaining programming for children and families to better connect. But honestly, the onus just has to be on individuals, sadly. I wish it wasn't. I wish it was built into our curriculum that all history was locally focused, because I think that's the most effective way to teach history, through just your own town.
I'd like to put in a word for the Wayland High School History Project. If you go to your website. Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so there is the Wayland High School History Project. If you Google that, you will see wonderful, wonderful things that Kevin Delaney and his students put on, and they do study Wayland history specifically. Number one thing, and another plug for the Wayland Historical Society, which we do have all third graders come and learn about the revolution before they go off to Minuteman Park. So a little plug for Wayland here.
I cannot emphasize how important it is to support your local historical societies and to tell them, if you want programming focused that your family can come to and you think, I would bring my kids to that if that existed, and they don't do it, tell them, because they want to do the things that you'll come to. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to support the organizations that do local history in your community. And please, I mean, I'd also love it if you came to the Framingham History Center and saw the things that I worked on and supported them as well. But really, if you're only going to support one place, I'm going to tell you, don't tell my boss I said this, but support close to home.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Yep. Feel free to jump in.
Is anybody interested in, I don't know if ever, did you send out the link to the exhibit? Okay, so if anybody's interested in my sharing the exhibit on a screen share, I can also do that as well. But it's not necessary because you can probably find it on your own if you need to.
Yeah, I just had one more thing that hit me, because I have you on screen. It looks like we're having our own personal conversation. But your comments about how they would separate families but not a China set, and also the the language of the bill of sale, how formal and legal it was.
Yes.
It seems like why, I mean, if they didn't care about this girl, why document this transfer so well? Like, why couldn't they just write like, you know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
a real powerful language to entrap her.
Yes.
Really label her.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is that she was considered at that price to be an item of value. And so it's the kind of thing that if you were selling someone a piece of property, a large piece of property that was of value, you would have a bill of sale because you want to have documentation of that transaction so that if somebody needs to, they can prove ownership of that item. And humans were considered to be personal items of value because it was not a cheap transaction. And so they wanted documentation the way that they would want documentation for any, the way I keep the mortgage or the deed for my house, that kind of thing. That's important. And specifically, this is a very interesting and sort of off-topic thing, but English people during the colonial period specifically, and this is true in colonial America up and down, really valued written documents and put power in the written word and in signed documents that the people frequently, either the other people who are affected by the documents who were not English, didn't understand or didn't put it in. But once the words were in the document, the English thought, well, I have permission to do whatever I want here now. So this is also true. This is more about the land deed, really, that we have in this exhibit. But that's also true, is just that they said, well, I've written it and it's an official legal document, and therefore it gives me this power that, even though it just seems like words, I have. And so it is a process of creating power when you create a document like this.
That's so interesting as a cultural, like a part of their culture. Like you think about Native Americans not understanding treaties because of a language barrier, but it's really that culture on top of it.
Yeah, that kind of thing didn't exist. And this is again off the subject, but if you haven't read, there's this incredible, fairly recent book called Our Beloved Kin, which is a history of King Philip's War. And it is incredible, and it really lays bare how the English used written documents, deeds, treaties, bills of sale to create a reality in which they had all the power that they wanted to have. And they forced other people to just like cede to the premise that the document was binding, even though it wasn't something that they already naturally understood or had in their community or in their culture. And just by taking that little bit, they were able to run. So it's a really interesting, it's really interesting. And it's eye-opening too, because I think we still today put a lot of power in legal documents. So it's fascinating. Yeah.
Just leave another second for any more comments.
Yeah, any more comments?
Kelly, I think, is commenting that it sounds sort of like how white supremacy culture began.
Yep.
Asking, is this like the Doctrine of Discovery?
Doctrine of Discovery. I'm not as familiar. What's the Doctrine of Discovery? Do I have is that something I didn't retain from high school?
Yeah, that's what I feel like.
It could be, which is amazing, because there is a lot that I have dedicated my life to studying history, and there is a lot from high school history that I don't remember.
Yeah, so I'm an English teacher, and I'm only learning all this historical information now, but with Columbus Day, I was on a webinar and they talked about the papal doctrine, and I thought it was called the Doctrine of Discovery. And it's when the Pope kind of declared that we had rights.
Oh, yes. Okay. That they just had the right to take whatever land they wanted.
Yeah. And that's what we've used in American court systems to, justify why we've treated Indigenous people in such a way.
Yes, that's absolutely right. That because culturally Europeans put so much power in the written word, and especially, I mean, the Pope there's a whole other thing mixed up in the power that people believed the Pope had, or some people probably still. I'm not Catholic. I don't understand it. I'm sorry. This is not meant to be in any way derogatory towards Catholic people. It's just that the Pope had a certain amount of power in a world that was overwhelmingly Catholic. And then for him to put something down into writing and say, well, you can just have whatever you want because I speak directly to God and he's told me it's okay, is just a absolutely very similar sort of concept. And this has always been true of colonization. Pretty much anywhere Europeans colonized, it's pieces of paper that they used to justify their actions.
And just one last question about why was no one has shared, like, if you see the North as these saviors, like they were abolitionists, like that's the way I learned about Northerners. I'm a Southerner and I'm from Texas, but so I've always learned this about Northerners, and when I teach students that live in the North that are from Massachusetts, they kind of have this air of like, well, we saved enslaved people. So, how did enslavers still get through the loopholes? Like, were there loopholes, or was it just not as enforced? You could kind of get away with it.
So specifically, the North developed its own, and there was very strong culture of abolitionism in the North by the time you reached, say, the Civil War. And this is a century before that. So this is a full 100 years earlier. Enslavement became illegal in Massachusetts at the end of the 18th century, in 1783, I think it is. And that's actually, it became illegal in Massachusetts through Supreme Judicial Court ruling, not by an actual written law outlawing it. So, the first 130 years of people being in New England, they were enslaving people exactly the same way that anybody in the South was enslaving people. It wasn't wildly different. It's just that because it became abolished in northern states so much earlier, they were able to construct their own narrative. And northern culture also developed in a different way past that point, that they were able to sort of, play themselves up as the hero. When in fact, not that long before, it had been legal to enslave people in the North. It is a convenient piece of just cultural amnesia. And Kay commented that Wayland was purchased, not taken from the Native Americans. And that's a very interesting, I cannot emphasize enough how much I think everyone should read Our Beloved Kin, which is an astonishingly deeply researched piece of work and can be dense at times. But I think even if you just read the beginning of it, it's really, really eye-opening, because most of the land in Massachusetts, and specifically in Eastern Massachusetts, was technically sold to English people. But English people had a way of making the land unusable to Native people, specifically by setting their livestock off into the countryside and not fencing them. And then the livestock would just destroy Native subsistence areas and make the land unusable to the Native people who had been using it in very specific ways for a very long time, and then conveniently purchasing the land that Natives aren't able to use anymore, or by basically forcing Indigenous people into different forms of debt, and then making it clear that the only way that they could clear their debt was by selling pieces of land. And so you can say technically that the land was sold and not taken, but it was basically forcibly sold in many cases. And I don't know very specifically about Wayland, but this is pretty true of Massachusetts in general, that it was sold, but it was also in its own way kind of taken.
Do you have any other book recommendations for thinking about empathy in history?
I don't actually. I wish I did. I'm not gonna lie. A lot of my conception around this also has come out of like my own personal experience of doing therapy. So I highly recommend in therapy, do therapy just to better understand yourself and your own feelings, and it makes it so much more enlightening when you're looking at other topics.
If you're going to read about King Philip's War, I loved The Name of War by Jill Lepore. She gives the history, but then talks about how like Metacomet and King Philip was sort of mythologized, and how that helped us sort of shape this narrative of the, what do you call it? I can't remember the terminology, the lonely savage or the noble savage. So, yeah, so it's really like a cultural history.
I love a good cultural history. I will definitely do that next, because I'm hoping to work on a digital exhibition about sort of relating to King Philip's War in Framingham. I'm hoping to. There's a lot of ifs and buts in the museum world right now. So
that's a whole nother presentation.
That is a whole other presentation. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good place to stop unless anyone has a urgent question. I'll share the book that Stacen mentioned and the websites that folks have mentioned. I'll email that out and make sure that Stacen and Jane get connected. Yeah. And I want to thank you so much for this presentation and for taking your time to speak with us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that people wanted to learn about it.
Yeah. All right, everybody, have a great night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.